Hi, and welcome to the OPOD, episode 72. This is City Councilor Matt O'Malley, and I am really excited. This is our first somewhat live taping of the OPOD with a very dear friend, someone I've known for 25 plus years, Liz Hauck, who, in addition to being an amazing educator and friend to me and my family, is an author of a absolutely incredible new memoir called Homemade. I cannot recommend this book more highly. It is emotional, it is raw, it is smart, it is funny, it is touching. You will laugh, you will cry, and everything in between. And I'm just delighted to have you. You've agreed to do this, Liz. So welcome to the OPOD.
Thanks, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, so before we get into the book, we've known each other since high school. We were both at Latin school. I was a year behind you and a year ahead of your sister, in between two of the four Hauck children. We did a play together in must have been your senior year, my junior year. Isn't It Romantic, which is a Wendy Wasserstein play. And I've known you and your family for years. I got to know your dad well when I taught CCD. When I was at high school at Latin, I taught CCD at Holy Name, where your parents ran the program. And loved the guy like everyone else. He was this gentle giant. What I remember particularly is I think I was the only teenager who was teaching. It was mostly older folks. I won't say people kind of didn't ignore me, but didn't take me seriously, except your parents and particularly your dad. Just always would ask me about school and the Red Sox, which I, didn't really follow as closely, but he never made me feel bad. But a special guy, and your relationship and his passing was the impetus of this book. So talk a little bit about how it started, and then I know I have some great questions, and we have a live audience as well, or a virtual audience that has some questions.
Yeah. Well, it didn't start as a book. It was never going to be a book. My dad, the cooking program, the book is about a cooking program that I ran at a group home for kids in Boston and kids in foster care, teenage boys. It was a program that I had imagined starting with my dad. So, sort of as a joke. We were teaching CCD together actually when I finished volunteering in Chicago. So I was 2 years out of college and living at home and teaching CCD and, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my real life. And my dad was talking about how he really enjoyed the rapport that he had with the kids in his class at CCD, and he missed that, that kind of rapport with the kids that he worked with. So in his capacity as a finance director, essentially, of this agency that ran a series of group homes throughout Boston, he, his work was transactional work. It was paperwork. It was grant writing. It was, kind of managing the budgets and doing kind of intake, and then, the paperwork when kids transferred. And so I kind of joked that a way that, a thing that he could do, obviously he wasn't going to do a catechism class in a group home, was to do a cooking program, because he loved cooking shows. So that was like a thing, the grammar of a thing, that he knew. Right. And I didn't really think that, he would think it was a great idea. And he was like, huh. He was like, I think that would be neat. We could be like Rosendale's own Jacques Pepin and, Claudine Pepin. And, I say in the book, I had him at food and he had me at team.
Yeah.
He, not long after that, was diagnosed with cancer, with mesothelioma, which is one of the fastest cancers. So kind of everything got backburnered, and it became kind of a survival project, really. And so, it wasn't until, several months after he died that I had dinner with his
Are you going to leave?
Jerry Rudd, who was a longtime friend of the family, and and of course my dad's business partner, who we'll hear from later. And I was telling him about this idea. I was like, oh, my dad and I had this idea. Do you think it would ever work? And Jerry was kind of like, oh, that doesn't sound like something that we really kind of do around here. But I'll keep you posted. And then not long after, Jerry left me a voicemail. You're familiar with Jerry's voicemail, slow, deliberate, that one of the kids had, in an effort to thaw a hamburger, a frozen hamburger with a steak knife, he had cut his hand open, requiring a number of stitches. And Jerry said, so it appears we may be in need of a cooking program around here. So if you'd like to give it a try, you can show up the next week and we'll just see what happens. So my book is the story of what happened, you know.
And it's just so, again, I loved it. You know, I was going to buy it no matter what, because I love you. I love your family. I love your dad. I didn't think I would be so engrossed in this. To everyone that is listening to this podcast right now, when you buy that, you will just be sucked in to see these boys, and you write with such vivid, you know, stories. And I just love that it's, you know, it's in many ways, I think, how you coped with your dad's death. It's we do different things. You know, my other sister Jill died very suddenly after cancer as well. And it's, you do these things, and you wrote, you know, and I love this. I love the that you write so beautifully. Grief is the ultimate marinade. You become more of whatever you were already, the lonely lonelier, the angry angrier, the restless more restless. And it was a way that you could process such trauma that was huge to you and your family, and also affirm his life work. Your dad was, and your mom as well, and I know Fran has joined us. Welcome, Mrs. Hauck. They were two of the most selfless people I've ever met. Everything they've done has been sort of and I would add Jerry Wright as another among those three, always giving back and trying to make a difference, and just good people. So you're both processing your own grief, and at the same time paying homage to a man whose, you know, life was cut short, but had a legendary career in the human service field. And in the time you get to meet these young men, these boys, teenage boys, they're at the end of state care, probably not going to be adopted. I mean, just so many issues. And when you talk about sort of how things went on for them. And as you said, this isn't, you know, the Great White Hope story. This isn't about, like, this was a true story. And there wasn't necessarily a happy ending for many of the boys. For some of the boys, there wasn't at all. But you gave them this great opportunity to have a respite. And I'm talking too much. I want to hear more from you, but I'm jumping all around. There was one line where, I don't know, Frank's friend maybe came and said, you guys eat like this all the time. It's like Thanksgiving. And I just loved that you gave that them. So you start the cooking program, probably wasn't too successful initially. You couldn't really get buy-in right away, would you say?
It worked for the first few weeks, and then and then there was a lull after that. It kind of went better at the beginning, I think, than anybody thought, and then and then there was the ghosting weeks. When I would swear that the TV was warm if I touched it, that they knew I was coming and left. And that's kind of when, the house parent was or one of the house parents who was usually there was like, I told you this would happen. And I was like, yes, but.
What made you keep coming back? Because you were working at the time, you weren't making a lot of money. You were in school at the time as well. You were paying, you got help from Jerry when you could, but you were paying a lot of this out of your own pocket. What made you come back when there'd be a 2 or 3, I think there was a 3-week stretch where no boys showed up. What made you just keep coming back?
Yeah. Well, kind of that I said I would do it, and that when it was good, it was really good,
Yeah.
So I thought, and I mean, and doing the kind of work that you do, and Peter knows, having been, in school and having, I kind of treated it like I was the moderator of a club, too, that it was like, okay, well, I'm not going to just stop. And it maybe even part of it was maybe I felt like I needed permission to stop, and who was going to give me permission to stop, because, who told me I should be there anyway, so it was kind of, maybe it was partly, the kind of that muscle memory of of showing up. It was also the idea that I knew when it was good, so that, I did have the sense that somebody, that they would come back, a couple of those ghost weeks, some, kind of kids were around and they didn't want to do it kind of alone, but they would take part of, whatever I had brought to cook, like as a snack, or like the soda. It was like, oh, can I just
Yeah.
have it? Like, and it was like, yeah, so then it was, so even on the weeks when there was nothing, there was something,
I tried to find the code red 7-Up to drink tonight, but they were out at 7-Eleven, so I'm stuck with seltzer. Although I should have done half of, we should have split a beer, because I know that you and Charlie split a beer to start this.
Right, Sam, that
To that point, though, you talk about the 4 guiding principles of volunteering, because I think this was a crucial part, and this is something that I had never thought of, but it makes perfect sense. What are the Liz Hauck 4 guiding principles of volunteering?
Yeah. Show up when you say you're going to show
Yeah.
up. Now this feels like a quiz.
Know
your task. Know your task and do it. Leave when you're supposed to leave, and then come back again.
That's exactly it. And I think, so that was what I was getting to. I was trying to find it in my notes, but yeah, leave when you're supposed to leave. I don't know that you would have been able to build the rapport that you did with the boys if it was more than this. And you got into this. You talked about sort of helping with the reading, helping obviously with life choices, and you did break through to so many of the young men and like build that rapport. But I think part of your success was you weren't there to, they called you the teacher, or they alluded to your being a teacher, but you weren't a teacher. You weren't a disciplinarian. You really were a neighbor. And I think that was one of the reasons that I just felt so drawn to the book. And that most adults, I would venture guess, in these boys' life were that authority figure and telling them no, or giving them those guidelines and those boundaries. You really weren't. Of course, you had boundaries, but you were giving them an opportunity to learn a little something, how to cook. You were giving them the special birthday dinners that they probably hadn't had in a while. You were giving them gifts that were really thoughtful and chosen for each and every one of them. And you weren't doing more than that, meaning there wasn't a catch. The catch was just you had to show up and help out if you wanted to help out. You didn't even have to help out. You could still get a meal. And I love to watch the progression of, how you became one of the, they started calling you Dog. It wasn't just Miss, it was Dog. It was, I forget who gave you the hug goodbye. Was it Joseph? And it was just like this really touching moment. And you had such a profound impact on these young men's lives. And it was just really special to watch and sort of live through that. And I think it, again, was such a way to honor your dad. And I think it helped, well, I'm projecting here, so forgive me, but like, I think it helped you deal with something that was so hard. And I think it helped Jerry Wright, who also lost someone who I know was like a brother to him, to see you there every week for the, 3 years or so that you did that. So Jerry, I'm going to bring you into the conversation. For those listeners, you may recognize the voice because Jerry was on the O-Pod before, not as himself, as Frederick Law Olmsted, and who's 199 years old today. And Jerry started the service care model and worked very, very closely with Charlie Hauck, and plays a huge role in I'd say Leon is the star of the book, but Jerry is a well-known one as part of it. The boys compared him to both a wizard and Santa Claus, and I would say both of those are high praise indeed. So, Jerry, talk us through a little bit. What was it like for you reading this book, where your dear friend and the daughter of your dear friend just beautifully told the story?
It's a delight to be here, Matt, and our lives together have been deeply, deeply meaningful, and it's no surprise that you were able to grasp the story as you did, and I thank you for that. The story that was told beautifully and exquisitely, I've tried to understand Liz and the difference between being a teacher, as she put it, and being someone like Charlie and I who work together. In other words, we never left them. We were always here. But Elizabeth had this ability to develop a discipline, as she said, show up on time and come back, even if they were not there. And with her discipline and the honesty with which she talked with the kids. This isn't one of those experiences that said, oh, you can do this and you can do that. It was, what are we doing right in the here and now? And how can we become a community together? And that's the power, one of the powers of the story, as I understand it and feel it today.
And beautifully said, as always. For you seeing Liz, walk up those stairs, for you seeing her come back, was it like seeing your dear friend Charlie come through? Obviously, there's a resemblance. They're both tall there that you can see. I think Liz said they had the same forehead, but that must have been helpful to you to almost process an incredibly shocking and sudden death of someone who you cared very, very much about.
I think really, Matt, what I felt was a victory for Charlie. A victory for his life and Fran's life and the siblings' lives. The Hauck family is unique, as you've already described it. There's a deeply rooted caring. There's an honesty of saying what you feel and think. And with Charlie, there was always a coming back to give somebody a second chance. And that, for me, was the root. So it was like a celebration. And as I sit here this evening, I'm feeling Charlie with me right now. And there is sadness. I'm in his office every day because he was the administrator. He was the rock that we built programs on. He was the quiet one. He was the one that did the responsibility closest to him.
Yeah. I mean, it was special that we got to see your relationship, that we got to see Liz and Charlie's relationship, that we even got to see Fran and Charlie's relationship. You shared in the book, Liz, that your parents didn't think they were going to have or be able to have biological children. Of course, they had 4 incredible, wonderful kids who are all local, and now, too many grandkids, I think, to count. But or you could never have too many grandkids to count. But you could see, they were going to foster kids. That was sort of their plan. And one of my favorite anecdotes in the book is so for those who haven't finished it yet, Liz, every week, of course, the boys would decide on dinner, but for a birthday week, you would get to choose. And was it who wanted the lobsters? Was it Wes or was it?
Yeah, it was Wesley.
Yeah. So Wesley wanted lobsters, and Jerry, which I actually think Jerry was right, but I'm glad that he allowed it, said, this is a place that we've got to depend on some state funding. Money's always short. We're going to look like jerks if we're serving lobster when there are other, similar programs that are running out of money. And Fran, your mom, insisted on paying for the lobsters because there was almost an identical situation where she and your dad wanted to do lobsters for someone who was poor kids in a similar program and couldn't. And I just thought that was such an interesting thing. So you went ahead and did the lobsters, and it's a wonderful story to read. And it's thinking, and then the caviar, of course, but the lobsters were just a special thing. So of all the birthday dinners, was there ever a meal that just you couldn't do? Like it was just like something that was just too difficult to cook, or would you just figure it out? Was there ever a time a meal that you said, I can't do that, guys, that's too much?
No, I mean, Matt, there were no big asks.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think when Wes suggested lobster, I mean, I don't think he thought he would get it.
Yeah.
So he, it was, he was like, I want lobster because I'm turning 18, and he knew that he was aging out. He knew that he wasn't going to be kind of renewed another year. There was an issue with him bringing a box cutter to school.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, we're going to do it. And he was like, what? And so then I had already promised him before I asked Jerry's permission. So I mean, in terms of timing, if I were more appropriate, Or, and maybe not a volunteer, like for all of, when we were talking about volunteering before, and, Jerry was talking about kind of being present all the time versus kind of showing up. I mean,
Mm.
it's a different kind of freedom to be a volunteer, right? It's a different kind of energy that you can bring when you're showing up for 2 hours a week,
Yeah.
conversations after the fact. Kind of people have said like, oh, if only the house parents did that. And it was like, you have no idea what that work is.
Yeah.
You can't, if you're managing where 8 people are and like whatever crises there are, you can't do a cooking program in the kitchen, or at
Yeah.
least, in this particular context. Maybe in some places that happens, right? There's no kind of generalization here, except that, that's the other side of the volunteer piece, is that you can do really well. You're like one tiny thing. But when
Mm.
you're in a care profession where you need to do 1,000 things, you can kind of do that well, but it's a different kind of energy and a different kind of task when you
Yeah.
have to manage all of it, right? Versus when you can kind of, focus on one thing. I mean, just like it, in teaching, in a classroom, in 5 classes a day and 155 students, certainly, I mean, I'm sure I have students who would have read the book who was like, she wasn't like that all the time, when I knew her, which is 100% true, so that's the other, kind of piece of the, volunteer piece, is that, is the kind of opportunity that it presents,
Yeah.
potentially.
Did
I'm
you did you finish this during the pandemic?
The book, no, but it was before the pandemic that,
Yeah.
that I had finished it. Yeah. It, so, the publication process takes like well over a year. There were like some additional, there was an additional kind of editing process, that would be the subject of a different time, a sensitivity read, and this question of, kind of being a white woman writing this
Yeah.
story, and then, this editing process where it was like, okay, but I also, like, in this body lived this story.
Yeah.
So in terms of reconciling the grammar with the, story, with the kind of external politics, that was a whole different kind of choreography,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah. And just folks know, you obviously, I assumed this, but it wasn't affirmed until the end, that you changed all the names and changed certain descriptions, so there would be so there would certainly be anonymity. Have you talked to any of the boys who may have read it or aware of it?
So, no, and it was only Leon, who I was in touch with after kind
Yeah.
of the life of the program, and then one of the boys, the boy who I call Frank, is in touch with 2 of the, has been in touch with Arlette, and has been, Arlette Grant Brown, whose name I didn't
Sure.
change. And and with one of the guys who worked at the house, so I have heard that he's engaged.
Wow.
It's so exciting, and I was saying to one of the guys, David, who I, was talking to fairly recently, I was like, I would love to kind of, I would love to, will you tell him I said hello,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously I would love to see him. But these relationships are complex in terms of power dynamics, and in terms of just like with with students. I mean, I know on social media, a couple of the kids are on social media. I mean, they know a couple of the kids. I gave my my cell phone number to,
Yeah.
and we had these conversations about Facebook, but I feel like they need to friend me, as
Of
opposed to
course. Of course.
kind of me like reaching out to them,
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned Frank. One of my favorite quotes that I wrote down was
David,
he he wrote, Frank, when he said to you, I know I used to be mad hungry every time, but when you kept coming, I don't know, I stopped being so hungry. And I know you well enough to know, you're not doing this for praise, but I'm going to give you a little praise. Like, you gave him something that he hadn't had, and that was just sort of that continuity, that every week showing up, that opportunity to have a friend, and he was, an older friend, but like just someone who was listening to him and valued him. And I just think that was such a special quote, because it wasn't about hunger for food, although of course the book is about food, but it's just, I think hunger for dignity, and that's what you gave him, and it was just great. I have more questions, but we have a lot of people who've joined this Zoom. So if anyone has any questions for the author or Jerry, just raise your hand and we will call on you. But this book, Homemade by Liz Hauck, is one of the best books I've read. So if anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll keep asking them. Oh, Mr. Galeota, I'm asking you to unmute. So unmute yourself, and hello, Mrs. Galeota, as well. There you go. Hi, Joe.
Hi, I have an interesting, I was able, like, unlike many of you, I spent a lot of hours at the corner of Perkins and South Huntington Avenue because my dentist during the late 40s, 50s, and early 60s was in that building. And I don't know whether, because of the absence of fluoride in Boston, I was a lot in that dentist's office, a lot, no flossing either. So I remember entering it on Perkins Street, and when I went to the dentist's chair, I'd look out and hear the trolleys lumbering by on South Huntington Avenue. So I don't know if the exact rooms are not, Jerry or Liz could, but it was easy for me to picture you entering, and I had that picture of the same rooms, reconfigured, of course, from a dentist's office to a.
They're not reconfigured.
Well, the dentist chair is no longer there.
Yeah. There's no, but you're exactly right. But the hallway, like the footprint that you're imagining, is the same footprint. Yeah.
Yeah, is that right? So that's why I could envision.
And
things.
probably
So,
the bathrooms are identical, right, Jerry?
we were never allowed to use the bathrooms.
Oh, yeah.
So that's a good question, Joe, because you never said where the location was, but having lived there and being the counselor for the neighborhood, I knew exactly what it was, and I knew the Alchemist, and then Cannery Square was where you and Jerry would go, of course, the CVS there. But what was the pizza place? Was that another pseudonym?
No, yeah. So that's Ideal. Yeah. So Ideals is like further up, like past Zesto is the kind of the fancy one that the boys weren't interested in. And then and El Oriental de Cuba is the restaurant that I kept trying to pitch, and nobody was and actually a chapter that didn't make it into the book, I did go to El Oriental with the kid who I call Leon, and he ordered a chicken parm sub. After, I was like, you have to try this Cuban sandwich. I know you're gonna like it. It's like an Italian sub, except that it's different meat. And he's like, no, so he like listened. The waitress came, he ordered chicken parm, which I bet you didn't even know that's on their menu. And at least it was in that time period. And then, and of course my like Cubano came, and I was like, see, it has pickles, it has pork, it has, so I ended up, giving him half of my sandwich. And he was like, after he kind of sulked, when the like sandwich, he's like, you were right, I should have gotten it. I was like, we're at a Cuban restaurant and you ordered chicken parm. And one of my friends from Chicago had recently, told me he read an article that like in Boston, in every restaurant you can get chicken parm. And I was like, that's totally unfounded. That's not true. And then I was sitting across from somebody who ordered a chicken parm sub at
I love it. Well, you got him to get the pad thai when you guys went out the later chapter.
Arlette did that. That. He copied it. Exactly how she got it.
Leon was just such a special character, and I say character, he's a real person, but I mean it in the. He was inspirational. And I know you probably can't play favorites, but I think he has a very special place in your heart, and I think that's clear to see. But it's a wonderful book, but it's an honest book. So this is sad what I'm about to say, and for you, those who haven't gotten that far, I apologize. This is a spoiler alert, but Leon dies, and I got emotional reading this. Jerry spends 2 weeks trying to get his body released to the morgue, and it's because his biological mother gave him up for adoption, and that was heartbreaking. That story, but then his adopted mother, who stole his identity, wouldn't return Jerry's calls. And I guess, Jerry, this is a question for you. you've seen a lot of really, and you've helped so many people. You've in such unimaginably difficult situations. You're still so positive, so happy. I mean, you're one of the strongest people I know for a whole host of reasons, but that's certainly one. How do you persevere? You've got a young boy that you helped for years, that you got to know, that was probably like a son to you, who has awful medical issues, who dies tragically, and because his adopted mother, who then surrendered him back to the city, won't return your phone calls. You have to write her a letter to get the body released. How do you get through that?
Well, I think there's something about my relationship with everyone I meet that people don't understand. And that is from what I feel within people. And I'm always trying to be as honest as I can. And when you begin to feel what's within people, then something happens to you where you get identified with where they're at. And I'm trying to tell this story very shortly because he had his mother come to his graduation.
Mm.
And he was so proud, so proud. The whole school was so proud of him. But he was at the hospital because he just was so excited.
Yeah.
And I asked the surgeons, I said to them, because he had special surgeons because of a shunt in his head from the first day of his life. And they said, listen, Jerry, you could pick him up tomorrow morning, but Leon would really like if he could come back and try the suit on that you bought.
Mm.
And he did, and he just stood there before the mirror and smiled. And the next day, everybody stood up when Leon received his graduation. And his mother was there. And I spoke with Arlette, and he came over and he stayed with his friends as they wanted him to. And then he said, well, listen, my mother's going to drive me home. And I said to Arlette, oh, I'm going to go down the elevator. And we got to the street and walked to the corner. And then he's asked his mother, Mom, you're going to drive me home? I don't have time.
Mm.
And I looked and he turned to me and he didn't cry. He just looked at and he said, let's go home.
Hmm.
Homemade. A certain dimension of it that's so powerful that Liz, with her family behind her and many other people, it's a community that spreads out. And so each person we meet, Elizabeth was able to say, there's a special moment for every person. And that's why the birthdays became a centering point.
Yeah. That's so well said. And so the elation he must have felt seeing his mother at his graduation, and then the hurt, or perhaps he was probably just expecting her not to drive him home, and that's why okay, Jerry, it's time to go home. I'm sure everyone that's read the book, he was funny. He was confident. He seemed to have a real confidence about himself, which is so, which is, I would think, rare. Certainly I didn't have that, as a teenager. And it's just so hard to read at the end. But then, it's this was a memoir about a real place and time that Liz was telling the story, and it wasn't going to sugarcoat it, and wasn't going to have everything wrap up in the Hollywood ending. It was, sadly, this is what happened. So we have a couple. I'm sorry, please go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add too, when we're talking about, his care, it's worth mentioning, when we talk about people who do this work, his medical team at, Boston Medical Center was tremendous. And in a way, they provided the continuity of care throughout his whole life. He was born in that hospital and he died in that hospital. And he had amazing surgeons and nurses who were kind of family to him because he was there so frequently. And a number of his medical team came to his graduation as well. So, Jerry is, documentarian, right?
Yeah.
And, takes pictures at everything. And in the pictures of his graduation, are, in scrubs, a couple of his surgeons who like came straight from the hospital. And there were, probably 6 or 8 of his, doctors, surgeons, and nurses who,
Wow.
showed up to like kind of witness that moment for him too. So he didn't, didn't have family in the traditional sense of family, but very much had, an intact urban family,
Yeah. Yeah. And didn't some of them come to the party back at the house as well?
Yes, yeah.
Graduation party.
And to his, and I think a couple came to his memorial service.
Yeah. Yeah. I know it was, again, the fact that the other thing that was so tough to read is the woman who was his attorney that did his adoption also did, was assigned to the whatever it was, the case at the end. And but no, what a special young man he was. And thank you for telling his story, because it was, I think it's important for us to read and us to know. So
Yeah, I certainly feel lucky to have known him. For me, the heart of the story is the conversations, with the
Yeah.
kids. So it's the book itself is kind of very dialogue heavy. That's my methodology. I think I store memory in conversations, and when Jerry said you have to tell the story of what happened here, it was like, okay, I don't know. I am not an expert in most of this, but what I know is the conversations I had with these kids,
yeah.
and how they shaped me, right? And then kind of layering in the conversations I had with my dad and the conversations I had with other people. But I think that kind of conversation, that for me, the way to write about relationship, right, and community is through conversation.
Yeah.
And Leon, the lines that anybody could identify as the best, most of the best lines in the book, are lines that the kids said,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I've got so many quotes that just, I think, were so profound, but also funny and nice. And again, watching it sort of unfolds, not in real time, because you condense 3 years into a book, but to see how you were able to foster that community, and they were able to foster that community. They were able to, come up with other ideas for meals. They were, they're boys, so they're not going to be overly affectionate with one another, but they're gonna, you could see that there was some caring there. And then there, of course, be new kids coming in and out, and that presented, I think it was, it underscored the system, but the way it currently exists and the challenges. I mean, two of the boys, I think it was, and I forget their names, but they, one one threatened a neighbor when he was on his own, a young woman, or woman, we presume, and then the other was at a house parent, threatened so that they would be remanded back into state custody. I mean, that was such a gut punch. But it just showed for many of these boys that was the life that they knew, and it was really scary to leave.
Well, and that,
yeah.
that was the only kind of guaranteed care that they knew their way back
Yeah.
into. I mean, that's where, when we talk about policy, what's wrong with that, right? That, that punishment provides a continuity of care.
Yeah. Jerry, you've worked in this field for decades. What's the wish list? How do we solve this? How do we look at giving supports and wraparound services? And Liz got into it a little bit in her afterward, because it's not a question you can answer on a podcast at 7:45 at night. We'd be here for a month if we were going to really suss this out. But give me sort of, what are the things that policymakers need to do? And I'm thinking specifically for really young men and young women, mostly young men of color, that are in state care, older teenagers that are going to age out. What you created a great model that is evident in this book. What else should we be doing? If you could wave a magic wand, what would be your advice?
I, one, do not believe that there's any answers that can possibly be developed into theories, because we're all different as human beings. And therefore, there has to be continually a flow of people into community who have grown up in caring situations, and situations in which the real is really front and foremost. And with Charlie and Fran, there was this beautiful exchange of telling it exactly as it is and letting people know this is where you're feeling. And beyond that, then, there is what Charlie brought, which was just being there. And so many times, Charlie would be around and just be there. So the challenge we have today, as I understand it, is that we're looking for answers. And so many of the answers are coming through medications, 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 medications. We're going to answer the problems with medications. And today we do not have the facilities that we've had in the past. The people are still working for less than $15 an hour who worked in these group homes. They can make everybody here, hearing these words, knows that they can go in workplaces where they're not going to have to put up with the struggles of someone who's going to get angry, someone who's going to disagree with them. So therefore, there's nothing I see around us now except that we can, each and every one of us, find those caring communities that we can join, probably small groups today. And through these small groups, starting with a family, I have hope that we will find new ways to care for one another as the world grows more and more complex.
Well said. Well said, and hopeful. Liz, is there any sort of thoughts that you wanted to add to that? What you would like to see in sort of supporting programs like this, and just all the systemic problems and racism and everything else that we're dealing with that get us here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's kind of a magic bullet policy, certainly, right? But I do think things like, I think most programs are pretty good programs, but I think that free lunch, you know, in schools is a way to kind of to deliver nutrients to all children who will all benefit from it, you know, and certainly, especially those most in need, but everybody is in need of, you know, kind of food and nourishment. But I think that is, you know, that is a concrete thing that, you know, in Massachusetts, you know, I think, you know, one of the many cracks, right, that the pandemic kind of illuminated is the kind of poverty in our country, right, and how schools function, you know, how schools function as daycare facilities, how schools function as cafeterias, you know, how schools, you know, serve these kind of multiple social purposes, including feeding kids, you know. And I know a number of states, you know, Boston has done this, Massachusetts has done this for a little while now, you know, kind of more states are moving to kind of universal free lunch, which I think is tremendous. Now, the next thing would be to like, make sure it's good food, not just food, but food, you know. Yeah.
That's great. And that actually, so when we advertise this on I sent an email out, we got a couple of questions. And the first is from Nina Kalita, who wrote, and I think this dovetails nicely to your point you just made. How do you think food deserts contribute to the issues that exist in communities? And what are your thoughts on community refrigerators that they have in certain parts of the city?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think I think those programs are tremendous. Community gardens, you
Yeah.
know, and community fridges. Yeah, I mean, I think are tremendous in terms of, you know, food deserts. I mean, people need food, and food needs to be more accessible.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't. You know, supermarkets that can jack up their prices in neighborhoods that don't have access. I mean, to me that's criminal. You
Yeah.
know, and I think it should be, you know, it should be addressed. I was going to say monitored, which then sounds like, you know, that's kind of, you know, politically kind of triggering rhetoric, right? In terms of monitored, but we, you know, kind of need to be aware to kind of have better access to,
Yeah.
you know, to food, you know, and to, you know, and to better food for, you know, kind of people who are, you know, kind of buying food with supplements, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Big thing we push for, which we're successful, but now we need to do a better job expanding it, is allowing SNAP and EBT to be used at farmers markets. And you know, that was a struggle to get in Boston than in the state, but now we have to have more farmers markets, you know, and more diverse communities and less affluent, you know, communities as well, so we can celebrate that access to good health.
That's great. Well, and what does that look like? Because I was so impressed to see that at the Rosenville Farmers Market, which is, you know, the one that I go to pretty frequently. But then also, you know, have witnessed multiple interactions where it's like, okay, you know, so you owe, you know, $250 or $275, and then it's like, okay, so then, you know, how do we like address that too,
Yeah.
you know, so that it's not the next person in line who's like, can you just put it on, you know, my debit card, you
Yeah.
know, in terms of that kind of dignity issue, you know, in terms of smoothing out the kind of delivery of access,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
that's right, in terms of access to kind of fresh food and spaces, you know,
Yeah.
and stigmatizing, you know, having it. I mean, I think it's tremendous to have it as, you know, kind of a debit card, so that it doesn't, you know, so that you don't, there's not a kind of visible distinction.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like destigmatizing, you know, kind of aid, which it's a whole different conversation, but, you know, how we talk about who gets help and when, right, is so different. When corporations get help, it's like, you know, it's this kind of meritocratic story of capitalism.
Mhm.
And when, you know, people who don't have, you know, jobs or adequately paying jobs and need, you know, kind of money to feed their families, it's somehow that's, you know, kind of welfare. I mean, we need to restructure, right, these kind of systems of access, and also how we talk about them and how we understand
Yeah.
support and assistance, I think.
Well said. Well said. Could not agree with you more on all of that. I want to be mindful of everyone's time, but we have a couple more minutes left. If anyone has any questions, just feel free to raise your hand for Liz, for Jerry. If not, we have a couple more that I'll go through. One, sorry. Mike Thomas just wrote, "How did you keep it all together?" I guess maybe that goes to sort of Jerry's questions where, you know, in sort of the tough times, and I think I know how you're going to answer this. It's the reasons I like you so much, but Mike Thomas wanted to know how during the difficult times, how did you keep it all together?
I mean, to paraphrase Jerry, one day at a time,
Yeah.
you know. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's certainly none of it was perfect or prescriptive. You know, it was really a lot of improvisation, I would
Yeah.
say.
Yeah. And you had no other choice. I think that's it too. You were there to do a job that you said you were going to do, and you had to come back, and it would be hard, but you had to do it. I found, and I don't know if this is because my association with you and your siblings is through school, but really with your parents, it's more through Holy Name. But I found it was almost some, not biblical, but some sort of religious overtones, not organized religion, but just the sort of religion of food, maybe, or of community, of neighborhood. There was one line where you talked about the blue tinned rolls being like communion, and it did almost feel like coming together, sitting at the table together was almost like it was spiritual, I guess is the word I'm looking for. Did you sort of feel that because maybe you felt a little of your dad's presence there? You're a spiritual person. Food is so important, nourishes the soul. I mean, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I think that idea of kind of sitting together, you know, there is something, you know, I mean, I do think there's something kind of holy in that, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, growing up, that is, we sat down to dinner every day,
Yeah.
like, I mean, every day we had dinner together. And it wasn't, as we got older and had different clubs. And then, my brother went to college first, and then I went to, it wasn't everybody all the time, but it was like we sat down to dinner, and that kind of space. And that was, a land before, technology, right? We didn't have iPhones or anything like, nobody had their Walkman at the table. uh, but so in terms of, that being kind of one of the prongs of the plan, right? I was like, oh yeah, this is what we're going to do. And it didn't occur to me that that would be like the stranger part than me showing up, was this idea of like, what are we going to do while sitting down together? Like who, and the house parent being like, I'm not going to mandate them. And I was like,
Yeah.
no, but I mean, how else would you eat dinner? This is how you eat dinner.
Let me ask on that, Jerry, would the boys eat dinner on their, or would the boys ever eat together on nights that Liz wasn't there after she began the cooking class, after she began the program?
It was nothing as Liz had a definitive schedule, but there were many times that there was a chef here once, and he used to get into the cooking. There was guys who would get together and they would do their thing in cooking. And so there always was some gathering around the table to get the food.
Yeah.
Liz's experience, I have to emphasize, there is something that was so absolutely in her spirit, I call it, in her soul, which comes close to religion, but there's something that religion brings fire in many people to this experience. But it's not necessarily because there's so many different religions and people are on fire, and there's so many people with just spirit that they feel something that must be done to keep humanity alive. And it involves being honest. It involves all the things that the Hauck family had around the table. And when they went on vacations together as a family to the Cape, when they were there together, but they were each individuals in their own right. And that to me is the dynamic of how you keep it together.
Mm.
You have to realize that we are individuals, but then we are a group of people together. And once you say group together, that means you got to start recognizing each other together. And I think that's one of the things now that is being more and more, because families had to stay together. But right now we're so in flux. So I think we have to look at the changing world every single day and say, okay, what's happening today? It's different. It's new. It's not the same world. It's different. Yeah. So we just strive with all our past experiences and put it together with ourselves within and everyone we meet to some degree. And with our loved ones, we're very close.
Yeah.
So it's a whole combination of dynamics between human beings.
Indeed. Indeed. Well, it's nearly 8 o'clock. So unless there's any other questions from our studio audience, feel free to raise your hand, your blue hand or your actual hand. Liz, I'm going to give you the last word, and it's not so much a question, but again, I've recommended this book to so many people. Both, I think it's such a unique Boston story as well, because we know these young men. We live with these young men. They are our neighbors. The theme of being neighbors. You're doing this because you're a neighbor. You're not a teacher. You're the neighbor. I love that. It's something that I know defines Jerry Wright. One of the reasons why he does so much for so many people is because he's a good neighbor. And I think that that's something that we need now more than ever in a pandemic, in a divided time in our country, in a time of turmoil and change. We need to remember that we're all neighbors. And again, I'm so grateful for you for doing this, for honoring your dad. for sharing this story with us. And I can't, I can't wait to, I can't wait to get more people to read this so we can keep talking about it. Cause I was just so drawn in to these young men and felt just proud of you for telling them their story, and proud of them for, doing well and doing and working hard and trying. And I'm just really grateful for you for sharing this story. And thank you so much. This was just an amazing read. So Barry's clapping, others are clapping. What's the last word now is to you, our author, Liz Hauck. How did it feel when you finished? Did you ever think like, and I'm sure you went through rewrites and edits as you were saying, but I mean, that must have been emotional to finish this book for a whole host of reasons. It's an emotional book. It's an emotional time. It's an emotional story. But what was that like when you finally finished it and knew that it was just going to print?
It was strange. I'm good at starting things. I'm not always great at ending things. So it was strange to think, how an experience becomes a story and then how a story becomes like an object in the world, and there are, parts of it that are so personal that then, that's kind of, a whole different thing that it's like, oh, these are conversations that I really didn't have, with anybody. I mean, you talked about, your sister, and I'm sure, you and Christine had different, kind of experiences than your parents. During that process, I heard someone say, when you lose a family member, it's like being at the top of a mountain and all of you have a broken leg trying to get down. And because you're all trying to get down, you can't, everybody can't support, the other in a way that if one person was going through something, so I think that, like you said in the beginning, this was, kind of a way, a way, the program itself was a way through my grief, and then making it into a book was kind of continuing this conversation. And I think I also like felt this like, oh, like what happens when it's over? Like what happens when I stop revising this story,
Yeah.
But a thing that I didn't expect is the kind of letters. I get letters and the kind of emails and messages and, through Instagram and Facebook, and to my school account and through my website, of people, and some people are just kind of saying they like the book. It's like a single sentence thing. I got one last week that's like, I read a lot and I don't usually write authors, but I loved this book. That was the whole message, but most of them are, people saying, starting by saying they read the book and then sharing experiences that they had that it reminded them of, so this, like, I think it was it Barbara Kingsolver? Now I can't think of who said, we read to not be alone, that, these messages come in and it's like, oh, like the kind of writing in the story becomes a different kind of accompaniment, to some people. To kind of feel validated in these like experiences, or to feel not alone in this kind of work with other people. And also it's this, kind of reminder of how many ways there are to show up. There are so many ways that we can show up for each other, in pandemic and beyond. If there's one takeaway that I would hope people would have from this story, it's that, you can do something, and it might not be a cooking program. It could be, I know a woman who's a, teacher in one of the BPS schools, that's a pretty, under-resourced school. And she every holiday season gets mittens for each of her students that she like matches to their personalities, and it's like this like tiny above and beyond thing that's such a big thing. A different woman, wrote about a yoga program that she volunteers in for like incarcerated people. There are so many ways, there are so many kind of projects and programs, there's so many ways we can show up for each other. But I hope we do that, emerging from pandemic and beyond.
I think you've inspired people. I truly do. With this book, with your story, with your dad's story, you've inspired people to show up and keep coming back. And that's such an important part of it. So Liz Hauck, thank you so much. You are amazing. The book is homemade. Please buy it if you're listening to this. Please shop local. You can get it at Paper Cuts in Jamaica Plain or Avery and Company in Brookline. You can also, of course, get it online, and but try to shop local if you can. And buy it for a friend. The holidays are coming up. It really makes a great gift. It is such a great read. It reads like a novel, but it's true people, true stories, and beautifully told. So thank you, Liz Hauck. Thank you, Jerry Wright. Thank you to Peter Favorito, our producer, who started the Scrabble Club at Latin School, and Liz Hauck was their faculty advisor. Thank you to all the friends I see, the Galliotas, Barry and Sally Shulman, of course, Fran Hauck, my sister Christine, everybody else. I'm not going to, Teresa's here. Hi, Teresa. Great to just be with all of you on this very special edition of the OPOD. Please don't forget, oh, hello, Mrs. Bingham. Please don't forget to subscribe to us on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you, Liz Hauck. The book is homemade. Go buy it. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Night. Thank you.